Coming up, feeling the effects of climate change. July was the world's hottest month since scientists started keeping track of temperatures 142 years ago. How is Indian country responding? Plus, getting the infrastructure bill through the House and the Senate. We'll talk to John Tsuda, who breaks it down for us. I'm Patty Thalahunga. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from Indian country today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahunga. As the world watches the evacuation chaos in Kabul, Afghanistan, the Taliban is quickly taking over. Tom Brewer is among the many former veterans who were deployed to Afghanistan through the years. He's Lakota and served in the U.S. Army as a helicopter pilot. Today, he's a Nebraska state senator. Brewer spent 8 years in Afghanistan and calls the situation there today heartbreaking.
We could have probably kept things from turning into what it is now. We just got, I think, in too big of a rush to get out of there. And unfortunately, a lot of the Afghans who came to trust us and depend on us were left hanging. And you know, they're lined up trying to get to the airport. I've been on the phone with them day and night trying to help them as best I can. But it's a chaotic situation. And you know, to be there for the building of the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police Corps, to be there for the building of the government, and then to see it disintegrate was really kind of a heartbreaker.
Brewer spent 8 years serving in Afghanistan. President Joe Biden moved up the date to pull U.S. troops from Afghanistan to the end of August. Evacuations are continuing. It has taken more than 150 years for Colorado to void an order from 1864 that called for white citizens to kill Native Americans and take their property. Colorado's Governor Jared Polis officially rescinded the two orders yesterday. A large crowd was on hand to witness the governor's action. When the orders were made in 1864, they led to the Sand Creek Massacre. That brutal assault left more than 200 Arapaho and Cheyenne people, mostly women and children and elderly, dead. Oglala and Cheyenne citizen Rick Williams found the original order while researching the aftermath of the Fort Wise Treaty of 1861, and it was his initial research that began the long journey to have this order rescinded. Jennifer Wolf, who is Ponca, is the president of Project Mosaic and was present at the signing. She says this is a step down the right path, but more work is needed.
This was just the first step in the process of reconciliation, that there is a lot more that needs to be done to make things right, to make sure that our people have equal access to healthcare and education.
Governor Polis told the crowd, while they can't change the past, they can honor the memory of those who were lost. A report by the Bureau of Reclamation paints a grim picture for the nation's largest reservoir. The Colorado River Basin is at a dangerously low level. A Tier 1 shortage for Lake Mead has been issued for the first time ever. The study released on Monday also declared historic lows at Lake Powell, the nation's second largest reservoir. 40 million people in 7 states rely on the Colorado River watershed. Arizona's water supply would be impacted the most, with an 18% reduction in the state's annual allocation. Nevada will see a 7% reduction, and Mexico will get a 5% reduction. These reductions will go into effect next year. Farmers will get less water, while people in cities won't feel much of an impact yet, based on a 2019 agreement outlined in the Drought Contingency Plan. The Gila River Indian Community and the Tohono O'odham Nation have the 2 largest tribal allocations of Colorado River water in Arizona. It's expected that farmers will increasingly rely on tribes for water. In Carson City, Nevada, more than 170 marked graves have been found at an old Indian school cemetery. According to the Reno News and Review, the graves date back to 1880, and some of the headstones are hard to read. The school is among hundreds of Indian boarding schools that will be examined by the federal government. That review, announced in June by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, came after nearly 1,000 unmarked graves were found at a former residential school in Canada. Stacy Montooth, the executive director of the Nevada Indian Commission, inspected the cemetery last month and reported her findings to the Interior Department, which then decided to add the institution to its review. A city in Bolivia is giving food to indigenous people in exchange for getting a COVID-19 vaccine shot. Authorities in El Alto are hoping free noodles and rice will entice more people to get vaccinated. El Alto Councilwoman Elizabeth Flores says residents are grateful for the food.
People have left really happy, really satisfied when they come to get vaccinated. Once they're leaving, we give them the incentive, and they leave very happy. We've seen an acceptance and that people are also grateful.
Bolivia is seeing fewer than 1,000 new cases per day. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thalahungva. The United Nations issues an alarming report on climate change. Jade Begay tells us what this means for Indian Country.
And John Tsuda joins us for a policy analyst from the Beltway. July was the world's hottest month since the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration started keeping track 142 years ago. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of scientists convened by the United Nations, issued an alarming report. Human-induced climate change is already affecting weather and climate extremes in just about every region across the globe. Even if nations started to sharply cut emissions today, global warming is likely to arise to around 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 2 decades. What does this mean for indigenous lands? Jade Begay from Indian Collective joins us. Welcome, Jade.
Good morning, Mark. Happy to be here.
So that was an alarming report. Let's start with a big view. What's your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I think high level, this report really confirms and aligns with what our communities have been experiencing and warning our respective governments about when it comes to the climate crisis. We know that our communities are on the front lines of the climate crisis, experiencing the impacts firsthand. So this report is really validating to what our communities are seeing play out.
And I know even though the United Nations Secretary General called this a code red for humanity, within the body politic, there's still a pushback. And the infrastructure bill is the latest example of that, where fossil fuel development is continuing on course. How do we change course?
Absolutely. So just to break down a bit of what is in this report says that the climate crisis is very much here. And over the next 30 years, between now and 2050, because of the inaction that has taken place over the last 40 years, because of the lies around climate change being a reality, this report is telling us that we're going to be experiencing severe climate impacts, meaning more wildfire, drought, extreme weather. And that is really what, we're going to have to just deal with. There's not much we can do to the course of climate change between now and 2050, the middle of the century. But what we can change and what there's opportunity to change is what happens from 2050 beyond, meaning, what we can change is how the world looks and how the climate, how safe the climate will be for our future generations. So the big recommendation from this report is that we need to rapidly keyword reduce our emissions and achieve global net zero by 2050. That will ensure that we keep the climate within the 1.5 Celsius mark. And that's really important, because if we exceed that 1.5 Celsius mark for our global temperature, and we start moving towards 2 degrees Celsius, we're in big trouble. That means many indigenous communities living on coasts will likely have to migrate, losing their traditional life ways. Our food sovereignty as Native communities and nations will be at risk, thinking of all the communities that rely on subsistence, having the salmon run, ensuring that the caribou are alive and well. So all of those things will be impacted, and in a very severe and stark way if we don't stay within that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. So to your question of what can we do, what is within our power, I think there's a lot. It's really important that we become activated around climate justice. This is going to impact all of our lives. This is going to impact all of our communities. Climate change does not discriminate, and we, like I said earlier, we're already on the front lines. So we need to be thinking of how this is going to get more severe over the next few years, and we need to be thinking of what are our community and what are our tribal climate plans? How are we going to build plans to adapt and manage global warming and climate change? And we also need to double down on ending extraction near or around indigenous communities. I'm thinking of fracking that's near and around our communities. I'm thinking of Dakota Access Pipeline, Line 3. We know from this report that CO2 and methane are the largest contributors to climate change. And if we can again stop large emissions coming from the fossil fuel industry, then we have a really good chance of keeping that global temperature within that 1.5 mark. We need to be really aware of what our tribes are receiving as far as federal funding. So again, this urge to be engaged around climate justice and climate mitigation and adaptation in your community is really important. Not just like you're saying for the infrastructure that currently exists, but what does our infrastructure look like in our tribal communities in the future? One thing that I'm really concerned about is how we deal with heat waves. For example, a lot of our communities have HUD housing, and we all know that not every HUD house comes with AC unit or central AC. And so this is, these are the sort of in the weeds types of things that we need to be thinking through now to prepare ourselves for warmer temperatures and more extreme weather, because we're, as I said earlier, these impacts are for sure going to worsen before they get better.
Well, and housing is a great example. And you're in Alaska, where many generations ago, people had underground houses. And you talk about the idea of air conditioning. You don't need it when you're underground. And those kinds of thought processes, if you use climate as a framework, really change everything.
Right, yeah. And we here at Indian Collective were really invested in using traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge to adapt to the climate crisis. In fact, one of our taglines for our climate justice campaign is that climate justice is bringing people back into relationship and connection with the land. We're seeing many people use traditional knowledge to already mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we're here to really support those efforts and increase accessibility to those pathways and to those strategies.
Indeed, the United Nations report actually included Indigenous knowledge as part of the framework. And I think what's interesting about that is, if nothing else, the long view. Yes, we need to increase the velocity of change, but we also need to think about past 2050. And that's just not something normally thought about in politics, but it is in Indigenous knowledge.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So first of all, you're right to say that the IPCC report includes Indigenous knowledge in it, but there is a gap there, and I just want to stay on that for just a moment because one thing that I, as someone who organizes in climate justice, would love to see more and more is our people sort of interpreting Indigenous knowledge into climate data. So I've been reading through this climate report, and while there's mention of Indigenous knowledge being critical to understanding the impacts, I think we need more interpretation around how Indigenous knowledge can be used as strategies to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So really encouraging, Indigenous folks out there who have leanings towards science and citizen science to think about those types of roles in your community and tribes, to think about how we empower our communities to report and collect data on climate change, because then that can be used in more and more in these IPCC reports. And one thing I want to mention about the IPCC reports, you mentioned earlier that it's a body of scientists, and while that is true, it's also an intergovernmental panel. So actually, this IPCC consists of 195 countries who ask for this science. These governments, which include the U.S., Canada, many nations, they ask for this science, and so it's really on them to utilize this science and take action. And up until now, we've seen really, I guess I would describe it as lazy climate and not bold action taking place. So, I think, again, just on the action strategy side of things, we need to get more aggressive at pressuring our elected leaders to take bold actions and around climate change. And next year is a midterms year, so really important to be thinking forward, and always excited to see Native folks running for office. And like I said, we're on the front lines of climate change, so we can bring that experience to any platform that we want to lead on.
Jade Begay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.
When we come back, we'll look at the congressional deal that made the infrastructure bill and the politics of getting that through the House and Senate. John Tsuda III is a regular contributor to Indian Country Today. He's worked as the staff director for the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and he is also a former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Today, he is a partner with Navigators Global, which is a company that provides political services to several industries, including tribes. John Tsuda joins us today to talk about policy and the impact on Indian country. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me again.
I want to start in the Senate, where you once worked, and the Senate got a bipartisan coalition together and got the infrastructure bill through. And in the House, there's a lot of division. Maybe explain why that is to folks about the differences between the two bodies.
The differences of the two bodies really are structural in some ways, and intentional. When the Constitution created the Congress and split it into two houses, the House side is a majority rule, almost much more of a parliamentarian style of body, and the founding fathers intended to have a separate body that would be more deliberative and would actually have minority protections for the minority parties in that body, so that they could actually have an opportunity to have an impact, and you wouldn't have majority rule all the time. And so that leads on the Senate side, usually to get something big done, you have to have some bipartisan input, meaning you have to have some input from members of the minority party in the Senate. And you don't need that in the House. You only need 50% plus one vote. And so that really from the foundation of the country through now, that still carries forward. And the philosophies that the parties have in the House and in the Senate differ on that basis, because that's the only way they can get their work done.
And in the Senate, there's a willingness to defy party leaders, basically, in order to protect your state.
Right, and that is true. You often find in the Senate that divisions fall down state lines and not necessarily down party lines, and it makes for interesting partnerships. But you also have not just states, but in some ways you have, especially with long-term senators, long-held beliefs, and they partner based on those beliefs. They find partners on either side of the aisle, and not just strictly down political lines. So that leads to compromise and takes a little bit of the sharp edge off sometimes of what comes out of the House.
Well, and speaking of the sharp edge in the House, this time there's a division mostly among Democrats about the infrastructure bill and how far to push and how quickly to push.
Right, and you see in the House a difference even among Democrats about what infrastructure means. You have sort of old school folks who think of infrastructure as bricks and mortar, sort of hard infrastructure, and then the sort of newer thought of human infrastructure, if you want to call it that, but more of a social net. Adding to the social net, it's all the various assets. And so, that there's a division among the Democrat caucus in the House on that basis as well.
And it's interesting. I remember the movie Lincoln and the horse trading going on. And, from now through whenever this passes, you're going to see that same sort of thing with people looking for really anything in a district to try to move that needle.
It does. And, when the majority in the House is so small, they really do have to account for it. It really made a big impact earlier this week, when 9 members of the House, out of the 435 members, 9 members on the Democrat side said, their preference was for the 2 infrastructure bills, the bipartisan one of the Senate, and then the larger human infrastructure bill. Their preference were for them not to be connected and to go separately. And just those 9 members, because the margin is so tight, have a big impact on the outcome of that debate just within the Democrat caucus, not even counting the Republican debate.
I want to ask you about another political question, and that is, when any administration comes into power, and you worked for Republicans, there's a desire to get things done right away, and then all of a sudden these roadblocks start popping up. The Biden administration wanted to end gas leasing and review them, and all of a sudden the federal courts are saying you can't do that. What's it like being in an administration with you have all these plans and suddenly the brakes come on?
Well, it can be frustrating, to be honest, and it takes some careful thought and planning. You have to step back though, and sort of philosophically and say, okay, that's the way our country is supposed to work. There's checks and balances, not only 2 houses of Congress and a president, but courts, so that things don't happen again. It's not majority rule, just steamrolling, and also that there's some thought given into new policies or new laws, whatever it may be, that there's some thought given, and the courts often provide that background. So I mean, you have to be prepared for that. And one of the things, that it's right that you try to get a lot accomplished early on in administration, but there are certain things that take time to work through. And when you have something like the oil leasing regs, they've been in place a long time, and it takes there are multiple steps to go through, whether you're going to be pro leasing or anti leasing. There is a process that you have to go through, and it takes a significant amount of time, and it's very difficult to shortcut that process.
And that's a lesson. I mean, we all think elections decide things instantly, but in the United States, it's an arc. And that arc sometimes move really slowly.
Yes, if you're smart, I think when you come in as a new administration, you take a look at things that you actually can push and get accomplished early on. And if you have the help of Congress, if your party's in power, it helps you get some changes in law. That happens quickly. But there are other things you have to just plan out that's going to take 2, 3, sometimes 4 years to accomplish.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahant.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. This is Indian Country Today.